All right. Can you see that shared screen?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So Spanish Florida is one of those places that, or one of those subjects in historical geography that is, it's often ignored, kind of not covered so well. And in your textbook, your textbook, The Making of the America's Culture Regions, there's only a very brief part that starts on page 21 on Spanish Florida, and that's in chapter 2. And there's one map. The map's pretty good. It's important, so have a look at that. But basically, page 21, half 22, and half of 23. So it's not very much. On the other hand, in your reading by Ralph Brown and the textbook that I have in PDFs for you, it's that textbook is titled The Historical Geography of the United States, and it's an old textbook, but it's a really good textbook. It's from 1948. It doesn't really matter so much because it's examining everything in Florida before about 1763. So anyway, the section there is a bit more. It's in chapter 5, so I want to make sure that you've read that. And it's really the chapter on Spanish settlement is titled "Filling Up the Land: Spanish Settlement in Florida and the Far West." So it's really just the first part of that chapter. So be sure to read for this, relative to this discussion, pages 68 through 76, and that's all on Spanish Florida, mainly Spanish Florida. Interesting stuff. Okay, Melissa's here. Hey, Melissa, how's it going? I'm glad you made it today. We're talking about Spanish Florida, and again, it's a subject that's often sorely neglected in historical geography textbooks. So I'm going to cover some stuff that is not really in your main textbook, but you will have access to it. And I've got some older maps, so here we go. I want to start off with looking at this general map of the colonial areas around the year 1750. So this is a very generalized type of map. It's from a historical textbook, and the thing I want you to look at is the Spanish influence, and that's to about the year 1750, or it could be maybe to 1763, something like that. You also have some symbology here. The little dot with a cross in it indicates a mission, a Spanish mission mostly, and a fort. And the forts appear to be mainly French, unfortunately. So anyway, on this map, I want you to notice that, at least on this historical map of around 1750, that Florida kind of sits out here by itself. And when we refer to Spanish Florida, we're referring to really more than the present day United States state of Florida, which has a panhandle, of course, but Spanish Florida and really the extent of Spanish Florida was even greater than what this map indicates. So we're going to talk about Florida today because it's earlier and it represents some differences in success with Spanish settlement. Now, later we'll talk about the really successful parts of Spanish settlement in the conterminous United States today, and that would be the upper Rio Grande Valley region that is mostly in New Mexico and southern Colorado, and that is still a viable culture region today. We'll also talk a little bit about Texas, and although we think of maybe Texas being a republic in the 19th century, we're going to talk about Texas as a northern province of New Spain and later of Mexico, and the occurrences, the interesting history of Texas, not just around San Antonio, but over here in what is today Western Louisiana and East Texas. And that was a focus of early mission efforts and an important area of Texas history. We'll also talk a little bit about the area, the Pima country over here south of the Gila River. The Gila River is the one that runs right through the Phoenix metropolitan area. And south of the Gila is this area of the Pima, another focus of Christianization. And then really the latest part of Spanish colonization comes around in the 18th century and all the way up until the end of the 18th century in California. So let's focus on Florida for now. And again, Spanish Florida extended not just into what you see here, but really into about central Alabama, and would include at some point the so-called Florida parishes that were administered out of Louisiana by the French. So that's an area of sort of vague colonial power. It was also an area of important American Indian influence. Can either of you refer or tell me what American Indian grouping was usually associated with this region of the United States?
Wasn't that Cherokee?
Well, the Cherokees are a little bit farther north up
Yeah.
here, but south of the Cherokees, want to guess again?
Choctaw?
And they're based near the Cherokees in Oklahoma as well today. The Muskogean peoples, the Creek, and the Creeks were not one tribe; they were actually a confederacy of many different groups, and among them were the people who called themselves the Miccosukes or the Seminoles, and the Seminoles later on wound up migrating into Florida. So we generally associate the Seminoles with Florida, but they actually came from this area originally. There were other Floridian natives at the time of Spanish colonization, and they were the focus of the Spanish mission efforts. Many of them, if they didn't die out, wound up leaving Florida and amalgamating with the Creek Confederacy. So it's fairly interesting in terms of, and we don't really know that much about, really don't know too much about the native peoples between Spanish occupation and British and American occupation. Okay, so I'm going to show you. This is obviously a pretty clear map, but I've got some older maps here. Let's start with the oldest. This is a portion of a world map, or actually it's the Western Hemisphere, from 1562, and you can probably see Latin inscriptions on there. This map is by a cartographer by the name of Diego Gutierrez from 1562. So it's a Spanish map of what sort of the known coastline of the New World, or at least the northern part of the New World. The Spanish, of course, had a pretty good idea of the island locations. Okay, so if you go over here in like the Windward and the Leeward Islands, those are well known to the Spanish. Then we have Puerto Rico, we have Hispaniola. This is where today the Dominican Republic and Haiti are located, and Jamaica, of course, and then Cuba. And north of there are the Bahamas. Now, the Bahamas were, I guess, a little bit deceiving in terms of size. They kind of show up as much larger. But look at Florida, the peninsular Florida that we're fairly used to. Even the Spanish had some difficulty knowing the extent, really the relative size of Florida. They had gone up the rivers along the southern Atlantic coast as far north as the Chesapeake Bay, which you can probably assume is the Chesapeake Bay right here. and then this would be the Delaware Valley, and then the Hudson Valley right here. They had done a fairly good job at mapping the Gulf of Mexico coastline. You can see the Yucatan Peninsula here, and Central America, so this would be like Honduras. And you also notice that there are place names along the rivers, a few, and again, this is only 1562. This is only, it's 2 generations basically removed from European discovery in 1492. However, if you look at the interior of North America, that was pretty much a matter of fancy over fact, as Brown would note. So they knew there were interior mountains, but they didn't really have any idea of the extent. So those mountains are about as realistic as the sea monsters out here in the Atlantic. So that's an older map, just to give you an idea of the developing, sense. The southeastern part of the United States was an area that the Spanish were wanting to look for. They were interested in finding gold. They wanted to find wealth, and they followed the leads of rumors, as most explorers did at this time. And you're probably familiar with some of the rumors that people like Ponce de Leon were following. You remember that one from elementary school?
The city of gold one?
Actually, that was in the West. That's a good guess.
The Fountain of Youth.
Yeah, the Fountain of Youth. But yeah, you're right. The Coronado coming up out of Mexico he actually crossed through Oklahoma into Kansas looking for the fabled 7 cities of Cibola, which wound up being the Wichita Indians' villages. But Ponce, of course, was heard about this Fountain of Youth, and that was one of those rumors that was, he was seeking in Florida. Of course, you think about Florida and sort of the physical geography of Florida. Florida is a really mostly lowland peninsula made up of lots and lots of limestone, the result of coral reefs over millions of years. And so Florida is pockmarked with all sorts of caverns, but all those caverns are inundated by water. A lot of them are fresh water, and there are, of course, springs in certain places. So maybe he was following something. There may have been a fountain, but maybe not a fountain of youth. Anyway, so you're familiar with that a little bit. Let's move on to a little bit later map, 1562. Let's look at 1640. So about 80 years later. And this is a map, again, you can see some Spanish names, some Spanish place names, but you can notice that Mexico by this time had been fairly well explored, but the peninsula of Florida is still pretty unknown, still pretty mysterious. We've got the Bahamas, the islands of the Caribbean, even the mountains of North America have at least begun to shape up, and you can tell by the lack of mountains here in the southern part of what is today the United States, that obviously somebody had been exploring into that area. So by 1640 in fact was about 100 years, exactly 100 years after the most comprehensive Spanish exploration party went through the southeastern United States. Who was that? Any ideas? Okay. Crickets. De Soto, Hernando de Soto, and that exploration, or that expedition, the De Soto expedition, was one where De Soto captured a lot of native peoples and enslaved them and marched them around the South. Eventually, De Soto himself died in in the process. So it was not entirely successful. One thing that the Spanish did accomplish in the De Soto expedition was they released a lot of wild animal or released domesticated animals, just like they had done in the Caribbean. They released hogs, they released goats, and they released cattle. And cattle actually wound up being fairly successful in reproducing. So there's, beginning in the middle part of the 16th century, a population of Spanish cattle gets established in the southeastern states, and because of the mild conditions of the southern region of North America, those cattle became feral and became free-ranging feral cattle that could be found in the Carolina Piedmont by the time that the English started colonizing Charleston and Savannah. So that's an important thing to recall. So anyway, but you can see the Spanish still were somewhat confused on locations of things. You can see there's really no idea of exactly how to access the Mississippi River. That would become a pretty well-guarded secret for quite a long time. All right, well, let's move on to talking a little bit about Spanish Florida and some of the regions, I guess, that we'll talk about. The main Spanish areas, what we call the borderlands, might be divided up into two groups that experienced relative success, and two groups, and another group that really didn't experience that much success. New Mexico, of course, was the area where Spanish farmers, and these were mostly New World born Criollo white Spaniards and their families, moved to the upper Rio Grande Valley at the, they were provided some good opportunities up in the upper Rio Grande Valley after the Pueblo Revolt in 1670s, 1680, right? And the New Mexico region became the most Hispanicized or Hispanicized, I don't know how we would say that, region of the present day United States. However, we have to remember that the people who were colonizing New Mexico were essentially Europeans, not mestizos and not Indians, but they did intermarry to a small degree among the local peoples up in the upper Rio Grande Valley. The New Mexican farmers and sheep herders of the upper Rio Grande Valley would also take slaves occasionally who were sold to them by other raiding Indian parties. So there were Comanche slaves among the New Mexican Spaniards, and some of them eventually, became intermixed with the population of New Mexico. But the Spaniards, the Spanish Americans of New Mexico, still retain archaic forms of Spanish and have a significantly or very distinctive set of surnames in New Mexico. Well, anyway, I can talk forever about those examples, but Florida is on the top of the list of areas where the Spanish really didn't have long-term success. They occupied Florida for quite a long time. From the early 1500s with the first exploration parties into Florida until the end of the 7 Years' War, what we call the French and Indian War, which concluded with the Treaty of Paris of 1763. And in that treaty, the Spanish were required to hand over Florida to the British. And I'll give you the timeline there, but Florida would not stay in British hands forever. It would actually shift back to the Spanish temporarily and then be taken by the United States. So, and when I refer to Florida, try to remember that we're talking about not just Florida, but really parts of southern Georgia, the southern half of Alabama, and even Mississippi. So it's a broad area, and it was a significant area where both the Spanish and later the British had some influence. So moving on, here's some more maps. This is a map, 1684 map from a Louisiana cartographer. And you'll notice that the Florida Peninsula is actually referred to as the Cape of Florida. So in other words, this is considered a region, you know, of sort of peripheral to what is really Florida, which is up here in the southern coastal plain, the Gulf coastal plain, which would be mostly Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia. And it's not the greatest map, but you can probably get an idea of what it is, you know, is being represented here. The idea that there's a great lake feeding the, I suppose that's the Santee or River, or maybe that's the Savannah River, I think, which is the boundary between Georgia and South Carolina today. That was an area that was of interest to the Spanish and the French and later the British. But you can see some places that are indicated up here, mostly at the head of rivers in the south. And at the head of those rivers, you see towns and names, sort of settlements and names of towns like Tula. You might see some other ones if you look hard enough. And these are, again, this is in French, so it might not be so obvious. But these are intended to be the towns that were the towns of the Creeks, the towns of the Creek Confederacy, and maybe a little farther north you might get into the Cherokees, a little farther west maybe the Chickasaws. So anyway, this is an area that is still not really well known. And you can think by 1684 you would think that the peninsula of Florida would be well mapped, but not so. Now here's a much later map, 1705. Well, not much later, 1705, and it's a map by a Dutch cartographer. It's actually a copy of a Spanish map, and you'll notice that there is that all of Florida is shown to be that whole north half, basically the north half of the Gulf of Mexico, that area tributary to the Gulf of Mexico. So on this map, what is actually Texas shows up as Florida and as Spanish Florida at that. So it's a little bit off. What would be Louisiana in 1705 is referred to as Florida, okay? And of course you might realize 1705, okay, that's, you know, what's going on in Europe to allow the Spanish to be claiming Florida. You might also notice that over here in what looks to be Georgia and South Carolina, you see something that says French Florida. So here's a division between Spanish Florida and French Florida. And in this case, this brings up an interesting problem. In 1705, you begin to have some of the earliest colonization into South Carolina. And those colonists are actually not just, they're not French in the national sense, really. They are French Calvinists, French Protestants, who had originally tried to colonize this same part of the Atlantic seaboard, but had been annihilated by the Spanish coming out of St. Augustine. And you've read about that. But eventually those French Huguenots, those French Protestants, because they were allied with the English, okay, and they were actually at odds with the French Empire, they were allied with the English, and they were allowed to settle in this area of what is today around Charleston and Savannah, Charleston, South Carolina, and Savannah, Georgia, along the coast. And so that early colony, at least on this map, is showing the French Huguenots into this region. And they would later be outnumbered by other English colonists, largely coming from the English sugar islands of the Caribbean. And I'll talk more about that, but primarily people, plantation owners and their slaves from Barbados. So South Carolina gets started as a colony of an earlier sugar colony. And so that's enough said there. But still look at Florida. The outline of Florida is still not very well known in 1705. There are mountain ranges in the interior, so nobody really understands what's going on in Florida. Florida is still occupied by the Spanish, and the area right here, you can probably see St. Augustine or S. Augustine, and that's really the Spanish hold on Florida. So the Spanish were establishing themselves around the northern part of the Gulf of Mexico, mostly as sort of placeholders. We know that term, placeholder, right? The Spanish were not so interested in long-term agriculturally based settlement. They were interested in maintaining political control over far-flung areas. And largely that political control had a few purposes. We'll talk about those. St. Augustine, of course, was the most important of the Atlantic outposts in what is today the southeastern United States, the Spanish outposts. And we've talked a little bit about Ponce de Leon and his early arrival in the early 1500s. They tried to get established in Florida, but were eventually run off by the Tamaqua Indians and others around 1521. This is before the Seminoles had even arrived into Florida. They established they established a settlement that later on, with the intention of maintaining control over the shipping lanes. And that, of course, was the village of St. Augustine, or the town of St. Augustine, which we would refer to as a villa, and the presidio that was assigned to protect that settlement was the castle of St. Marcos, or Castillo de San Marcos, and that was the most. That's a surviving landscape artifact. Established in 1565 and would be retained for nearly 200 years, so to 1763. So in that 200 years, you would kind of expect, that's plenty of time to get a population going and to establish a significant French foothold in the American South, but it didn't happen. And this is one of those, it's one of those examples of sort of negative data that we often overlook. Okay, New Mexico got started a lot later. The New Mexico settlements got started a lot later, and it's even farther afield than Florida. But nobody really was interested in going to Florida, and there was no real good economic draw to Florida by actual settlers. The only people that wound up going to Florida during the Spanish tenure there were soldiers and friars, soldiers and priests, mostly because the Roman Catholic Church was interested in converting the native peoples anywhere where the Spanish had control. Now, we'll talk a little bit about that in a second, but the Spanish, the Roman Catholic priests being protected by the Spaniards in St. Augustine in the Presidio were never very successful in getting many converts to Christianity during the first 150 years or so. It was only toward the very end of Spanish control of Florida that the military was actually able to extend Spanish influence into the interior as far north as central Alabama and central Georgia. And that was largely due because the Spanish crown had decided to quit protecting the priests, and there was sort of a disconnect between the Roman Catholic Church and the crown. So the reason they were drawn into that was because of trade with the Indians for those commodities that the Indians could provide, things like furs and deer skins. And the Indians, of course, wanted Spanish goods more than the Spaniards wanted Indian goods. So there were a lot of interactions. Of course, the manufactured goods were needed by native peoples, by the Creeks in this area. Well, the Spanish gradually lost interest and lost control of of Spanish Florida. And in 1763, when Spanish Florida was turned over to the British in the Treaty of Paris, it was the British turn, mostly Scottish traders, who came in and took the place of those Spaniards. And so beginning in 1763 is when we have the sort of infiltration of the southern United States by Scottish fur traders, Scottish traders who would go and live among the Indians in the American South. And this would also include groups like the Cherokees. But these Scottish traders were, fairly independent, but they wound up intermarrying a lot with the native peoples. And so you begin to see in the latter 1700s the emergence of a mixed blood population, a mixed blood elite population within the southern Indian tribes, the groups we would later call the 5 civilized tribes. And those are the Cherokees and the Creeks, the various groups of the Creek Confederacy, the Chickasaws and the Choctaws, and somewhat less the Seminoles. The Seminoles had by that time migrated down into the sort of the void of control of northern and central Florida. Later on, the United States would wage war against the Seminoles under Andrew Jackson, and the Seminoles would retreat farther south into the Lake Okeechobee and marshy areas of the Everglades. So the point of this is that the Spanish were there. The Spanish had a long presence, and even after 200 years of occupation, the Spanish really had not anything to speak of in terms of population. At the very most, the most liberal number I can come up with is at its extent, there were maybe 6,000 Spaniards in all of Spanish Florida, not just peninsular Florida. And that's probably an overestimate. Other estimates are around 4,000. So I'll let you see the rest of, or I won't read this card to you, but if we look at the village of St. Augustine, you'll notice that St. Augustine is established in 1565 before the laws of the Indies, but it follows the same pattern that we had in the laws of Indies. The towns included a plaza, basically a square within the town, and then around that central plaza were the administrative buildings, a church at the center. And I'm trying to draw this out a little bit, but and there was a gridiron street pattern. So this is a pretty standard pattern of settlements, sort of settlement morphology of the Spanish throughout their domain. Again, kind of following the lead of the Roman Empire. So what is the purpose? What is the purpose of St. Augustine? There were several. Like I said, it was largely geopolitical. St. Augustine was a kind of a placeholder for the Spanish. It was also, Spanish Florida also served as a kind of a buffer against other powers like the English and the French. Now, the English were not much of a threat to the Spanish until later on in the 16th century. And of course, you probably realize that event, the rise when the English and the Spanish were beginning to really challenge one another. Anybody want to help me out with what happened in the latter decade, the last 2 decades of the 16th century between Spain and England? Spain actually attempted to invade England, right? Spain took it upon itself to launch an invasion fleet to conquer England. And through a stroke of enormous luck, the entire Spanish Armada was hit by a very, very severe storm. As they were attempting to get away from the storm, they actually wound up getting totally swamped by it, and the Spanish Armada was mostly lost in 1588. And that major weakening of Spanish naval power allowed the English to expand their influence into the New World under Elizabeth I. Queen Elizabeth I was no friend of the Spanish. And this is when we begin to see the rise of privateering in the Caribbean and around the Gulf. And there had always been pirates, of course, because there were gold shipments coming out of Mexico. And pirates were, of various ethnicities, like French and British and Dutch and perhaps others. And the pirates were, of course, out for themselves, but piracy became somewhat formalized under Queen Elizabeth I, who was actively wanting to get revenge on Spain. And because Spain was a Roman Catholic power, there was both, and England was not, okay, was essentially not under the influence of the Pope. There was developed this pattern of privateering, and basically a privateer is a pirate who has actually a lot of firepower and is essentially sanctioned by the state. So as they are sanctioned by the state, hang on just a second, I better get that. Yeah, it's no big deal, and you can go ahead and have a look around. I don't have a lot of furniture here, so
You just want to do all the windows?
yeah,
With shutters?
with plantation shutters. Yeah.
All we make.
Okay,
I'll go get my tape measure.
no problem.
All right, thank you.
Sure.
Sorry about that.
No, it's all right. Sorry about that, folks. I had someone coming by to do some estimates for some work on the house. So anyway, let's go back to where we were. So the Spanish are shipping gold out of Veracruz in Mexico, and I'll show you a little bit about the pattern of that. But under Elizabeth I, Elizabeth I was the queen who sort of formalized piracy using this system that we refer to as privateering. And the privateers basically were out for themselves. They were hired guns. They intercepted Spanish gold shipments, and of course, the part of that shipment then was taken back to England and handed over to the crown. But of course, there was a lot of profit to be made in that too. So, piracy on the high seas is a horrible thing, but in this case, we have kind of the state sanction of piracy, and Elizabeth I was getting a bit of a cut of it too. So, well, let's talk a little bit about, so we've got an English threat, and the Spanish have this, they're Spanish themselves are looting the Inca Empire and the former Aztec Empire, sending gold and silver back to Spain, inflating the economies of Spain and Europe in general, causing great rising prices. And all the while, the English are attempting to, the English are acting like parasites on this very, very very, very rich flow of goods looted from the native peoples. All right, so let's move on here, and I'm going to show you a map here of these are ocean currents, and this is a physical geography map, but it also has some routes. If you want to look at this, I'm not going to talk about each one of them, but these are some of the routes of some of the early explorers. You can kind of see how Columbus's 4 voyages went. But to understand the roots of, and that's ROUTES, the roots of European shipping in the Atlantic at this time, they're all sailing ships, of course, and they have to utilize both ocean currents and wind currents. And this map is of ocean currents only, but there are 2 primary wind currents. There's a system of winds that are very, very reliable, referred to as the tropical easterlies. And the tropical easterlies flow on either side of the equator from east to west. And those tropical easterlies are very, very constant, very strong, and once they're caught, you can get anywhere in the west pretty quickly. On the other hand, the way that the navigators would get back to Europe was to go farther north, up to close to around 40 degrees north latitude, anywhere between 35 and 40 degrees north latitude, and they would catch the westerlies, and the westerlies are not as constant, not as reliable, but they're needed. And there's also the Gulf Stream. The Gulf Stream is the very strong, warm ocean current that begins in the Gulf of Mexico, flows right along the Atlantic coast up to Cape Hatteras in North Carolina, in the Outer Banks area, and then it begins to cut across the Atlantic toward Europe, even continues quite rapidly and strongly as far north as Scotland and Scandinavia. And so this is why areas north of 60 degrees north latitude actually remain ice-free most of the year. Of course, now they're really ice-free, but this is an area that the Gulf Stream warms Europe. So, but the Gulf Stream is also a very powerful ocean current that the navigators caught to move on west. So basically, in oceanographic terms, we refer to this circulation as a gyre. That's a G-Y-R-E. And that gyre then is directing the sailing vessels between Europe and the New World. Now, the Gulf Stream has its origins in the Gulf of Mexico, and you can see the Gulf of Mexico has weak, warm currents, but that Gulf Stream takes off between the Straits of Florida. That's the area between Key West, the Florida Keys, and Cuba. As you know, that's only about a 50-mile stretch. It's the warm Gulf of Mexico creates sort of like a pinch point. Like when you pinch a hose, it increases the pressure, and so that pushes off the Gulf Stream, and it moves on quickly into the Atlantic. So that's just the physical geography. Now, if we look down here, right about there, I'm pointing to the Veracruz area, is where all of the gold shipments from New Spain are shipped from. That was one of those centralized Spanish policies that all New Spain shipments left Veracruz. There was only one port, and they typically would go to Havana and to outfit for the transatlantic trip. Gold shipments coming out of the Inca region, coming out of Peru, would typically leave Cartagena. Sometimes they would leave from the Pacific and then cross the Isthmus of Panama. But basically, all of the shipments wound up having to go through the Straits of Florida. So this was a pinch point, and it was a strategic location. And this is the reason why the fortress at San Augustine was established where it was. Okay, so here are some notes for you. I've mentioned about the Huguenots a little bit. Prior to the Huguenots landing in the later 17th century, early 18th century in South Carolina, earlier attempts were made. And you often read about the French, and you hear about the early commander at St. Augustine, Pedro Menendez, as massacring the French in the coastal areas of South Carolina at Fort Caroline, for example. And that's always kind of confusing because these were French colonists, but they were Calvinists. They were not sanctioned by the French crown. They were actually sanctioned by the English, because a lot of those Huguenots during the French counter-revolution, because they were Protestants, were severely persecuted, murdered in various events. But the Huguenots were kind of the scapegoats in France. They were scapegoats because they were not Catholic. They did not have to follow the Catholic prohibition on usury. Usury is a Roman Catholic term that refers to the charging of interest on money loaned. So the Roman Catholic Church loaned money, but didn't allow others to do it to this point. So if you were non-Catholic, you were either a Protestant or you were a Jew, and those were the people who wound up being the people with the strongest financial clout, and the people who financed a lot of the early capitalism, which was based mostly in the Low Countries of what is today the Netherlands and Belgium. So French Huguenots and Jews were both identified as, often blamed for a lot of the economic woes at this time. And of course, the Spanish Inquisition targeted the Jews. But the Huguenots in France were targeted by the French crown. And so a lot of them decided to leave. A lot of them went to Amsterdam. They went to the Low Countries. They also, many of them went to England. They wound up in London, including my own ancestors. They wound up going from Normandy to London, and from London arrived in Virginia. So early Huguenot colonists were moving from England and from the Low Countries into the American colonies. But you might notice that Menendez massacred this group of Huguenot colonists and stopped their early foothold in South Carolina. But don't confuse that with the French crown, with the official French colonization effort. These were Huguenots. They were Calvinist Protestants, and they were allied with Elizabeth I of England. Well, anyway, that's probably enough. But the mission at St. Augustine was initially occupied by the Franciscan, the order of the Franciscan order, and then later replaced by the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits, in 1571. What did they do in Florida? Well, you know about Florida oranges. They were actually introduced by the Spanish in this very, very early period, although they're not the same ones you have today. The Spanish also introduced wheat. They tried to grow olives. Olives didn't do so well in Florida. Of course, the climate is totally different than what you have in Spain or the Mediterranean region. Here's a map that shows the Gulf Stream, and the Gulf Stream picks up speed as it circulates around the Gulf of Mexico and has this choke point at the Straits of Florida, and then really picks up speed right here. So it made sense for St. Augustine to provide cover for the galleons coming out of Veracruz. So Veracruz is the main shipping point. Cartagena's sort of the secondary one. Havana is right here close to the Straits of Florida. So between Havana and St. Augustine is that critical area, and that's why the Spanish were interested in keeping patrol of this part of the route. Of course, a lot of the privateers and the independent pirates were based not so much on the coast as much in the Bahamas. And the Bahamas became associated with piracy to a great deal at that time. But all you had to do is hit one of these big, heavy, gold-laden galleons, and you had a fortune, essentially. Now, in terms of the missionary responsibility of the Spanish, recall that there was that the Spanish crown and the Roman Catholic Church had kind of an agreement that Spanish conquest was going to be sanctioned by the church, but the Spaniards had an obligation to extend the Roman Catholic Christianity into those areas that it conquered. So the way that it did that was to establish that mission presidio combination. And so even in Florida, we have that. So there were three periods, three different directions of colonization and influence that we can look at. The first one is what we can call the saltwater mission field, which is just the barrier islands of Georgia, the Georgia Sea Islands, and all up to South Carolina, to Charleston. Is this area of the Georgia Sea Islands? Thank you. And that area of the Georgia Sea Islands is what the Spaniards referred to as the Golden Isles. Now, there were some native peoples there, but a lot of them eventually were dispersed to the interior and became a part of the Creek Confederacy. The Creek Confederacy, by the way, is by far the most significant native sort of, we would call it today a kind of a unified, not federation, but a group of different tribes who were very different, and they were coordinated enough to really defend their territory for a while. Supranational organization is what we might call it. Anyway, the freshwater mission field was associated with the area around the St. Johns River. It was not at all successful. Local Indians were not interested in dealing with the church. Again, it was the last part of the last few decades of Spanish Florida's history when we have the extension of a sanctioned road and trading path into the interior. Wherever you see Spanish colonies, you often see this term, the Camino Real, or essentially that's just the King's Road, or it's an official sanctioned route. That's all it is. It's not a road. It was just basically a trading path. And it was just a trading path that already existed, but the crown took responsibility for protecting it and allowing traffic over it. And the Camino Real in Florida extended to the northwest out of St. Augustine, and that route went all the way to about central Alabama, to about where Montgomery, Alabama is today. And outward away from that is where we have trade relationships with the Creeks and some of the other smaller groups prior to the end of the Spanish influence and French and Indian War in 1760, end of it in 1763. But the outposts that the Spanish had in what is today the Gulf Coast would be at Apalachee Bay, which is where Pensacola is located today, and Mobile Bay in Alabama. So those two areas were important ports for the interior trade between the Spanish and the Creek Nation. And in 1763, Scots would arrive, and they would set up shop in the same area, basically replace the Spanish as traders. So to wrap up, Spanish Florida is sometimes referred to as a colony without colonists. 200 years and only 3,000 to 4,000 Spaniards at the very most, maybe 6,000, occupied the area. Here's the sequence of sort of geopolitics from 1560 or 1513, whatever, up until 1763. Spain held this region and then lost it to England at the First Treaty of Paris in 1763. The British were never interested in Florida. They did nothing with it. And so it was, in British hands. It was, officially British for 20 years until 1783, when the United States defeated, or 1781, the United States defeated Britain in its independence, war for independence. And the Second Treaty of Paris, which was the negotiations for the United States to be recognized. In those negotiations, Florida was returned to Spain, and that was okay with the United States at the time because they didn't want the Brits there, right? So that was actually a win for the United States to kick out the British and allow the Spanish back, because the United States, or the Americans, realized that the Spanish, had they not done anything for 200 years, they weren't going to do much then. So the United States was okay with Spain coming back. And then, of course, it only took Andrew Jackson a little while to march down into into Florida following the end of the War of 1812, marched down into Florida largely to conquer areas that had become areas of refuge for runaway slaves. Jackson marched down into Florida and essentially began a pretty brutal war between the United States and the Seminoles, known as the Seminole War, Seminole Wars actually. But officially, Florida became part of the United States with the Adams-Onis Treaty of 1819 that established clear boundaries for the Louisiana Territory, Louisiana Purchase, and New Spain, which was about to become Mexico. All right, so that's a mouthful. Now, here are some slides of the fortress. This is the Castillo de San Marcos. This is the tourist destination that most people are interested in. It's probably what most people think of when they think of St. Augustine, and it is a serious fort surrounded by a moat. These are pictures from the 1950s that were done by the Historical American Building Survey. I visited it. I have lots of photos of it. This fortress was actually used as a prison, sort of a prison camp for the Apaches under the Chiricahua Apaches under Geronimo, who were captured in the late 1800s in Arizona. They shipped them off to Florida prior to shipping them back by train to Fort Sill in Oklahoma. And this is the interior of the fortress. You could easily defend this. And that's the outside of the moat. And that's about it. So I'm going to come back to, we're going to come back to New Mexico next time. I know this was a long discussion or a long lecture. It wasn't much of a discussion, but do you all have any questions? Do you have anything you'd like to discuss about this while we still have a little time?
I'm good, sir.
You're good. Okay, thanks, Philip.
Thank you.
All right, thanks, Melissa.
Have a good one.
All right, you too. Have a good day. Have a good weekend.
You too.
Adios.